And when he was cast out, Pharaoh's daughter took him up and nursed him for her own son. And Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and in deeds. And when he was full 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brother and the children of Israel. And seeing one of them suffer wrong, he defended him and avenged him that was oppressed and smote the Egyptian. For he supposed his brethren would have understood how that God by his hand would deliver them, but they understood not. And the next day he showed himself unto them as they strove, and would have set them at one again, saying, Sirs, ye are brethren? Why do ye wrong one another? But he that did his neighbor wrong thrust him away, saying, Who made thee a ruler and a judge over us? Wilt thou kill me as thou didst the Egyptian yesterday? Then fled Moses at this saying, and was a stranger in the land of Midian, where he begat 2 sons. And when 40 years were expired, there appeared to him in the wilderness of Mount Sinai an angel of the Lord in a flame of fire in a bush. And when Moses saw it, he wondered at the sight, and as he drew near to behold it, the voice of the Lord came unto him, saying, I am the God of thy fathers, the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses trembled and durst not behold. Then said the Lord to him, Put off thy shoes from thy feet, for the place where thou standest is holy ground. I have seen the affliction of my people which is in Egypt, and I have heard their groaning, and am come down to deliver them. And now come, I will send thee into Egypt. This Moses whom they refused, saying, Who made thee a ruler and a judge? The same did God send to be a ruler and a deliverer by the hand of the angel which appeared to him in the bush. He brought them out after he had showed wonders and signs in the land of Egypt, and in the Red Sea, and in the wilderness 40 years. I find it deeply instructive for myself. As we know, his life was really broken into 3 different parts. It's comprised of 40 years. It's been said that the first 40 years of his life, he was learning to be a somebody. The second 40 years, he learned to be nothing or a nobody. In the last 40 years, really, he learned that God was everything. He was all in all to him. And I think a lot of us can relate to the life of Moses, maybe not in the same partition with respect to the 40-year segments. I doubt that any one of us on the call would live to be 100. I think that as a general rule, the progression we see in Moses' life is not atypical to what a believer may pass through in part. What's caused me to reflect a lot, as we see at the beginning of Moses' life, I think about his parents. With respect to the day and age in which Moses was born, his parents showed tremendous courage, I think, just to even have a child at that time, where we know the baby boys were to be thrown into the Nile River. As a parent myself to 3 children, teenagers, and one almost out of teenager years, there's a certain part of us at times that may feel apprehension to be raising children in the day in which we live. Moses' parents showed tremendous courage when Moses was born. His parents placed him in an ark in the Nile River. Pharaoh's daughter found him, and he was nursed until he went into Pharaoh's house. And I'm sure that those years were deeply impactful to Moses for at least as long as he was nursed by his mother, and planted seeds that carried an impact for years to come. But we know that Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. It says here that he was mighty in acts and in deeds. And it says he was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. And with this time in his life, he was probably in line to the throne of Pharaoh himself. He really enjoyed, in many respects, all that the world could possibly offer him at that stage in his life. And yet, Moses, after a period of time, began to feel the emptiness of it all. We know that when he reached 40 years of age, it came into his heart to visit his brethren. And I think that he learned what many learn, and that is that the world really has nothing to offer. It started with Moses refusing to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. And I think that refusal really set in motion what followed. He perhaps could have refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, but yet remained in the place that he was. But we know that is not what he did. Had he remained, some would have said that could have been the reasonable choice. He could have remained there and tried to assert his influence with Pharaoh and those in high authority in the land to perhaps bring about the possible setting free of the Israelites from their time of bondage. But he didn't do that. He made a choice to ultimately associate himself with God's people. He could have remained with one foot in and one foot out, but that is not the path that he chose. The path that he chose was to suffer affliction with the people of God. And it was really faith that caused or to lead him out of the place that he was to place himself in association with God's people. And he endured as seeing the one who was the King of Glory ultimately. And I'm sure that this was a time in his life where he probably didn't feel at home anywhere. He didn't feel at home in Egypt. He didn't feel accepted by his brethren. And he fled into the wilderness at this time in his life when he was a full 40 years old. The next 40 years of his life, we know that there's not a lot written about it. We know that he fled to the desert to a place called Midian. We know that he took a bride, a Gentile bride. He had two sons when he was there. And his bride was one of Jethro's daughters. And he tended sheep in the desert for those full 40 years. I'm sure that was not an easy time in his life. And he had a lot to learn and unlearn, we might say, with respect to what he had learned in Egypt. The Moses that we see at 80 years of age was a different Moses than we see at 40 years of age. But those were years that were not wasted. They were necessary years in his life. It's been said that he was in the schoolhouse of God as really we all are as true believers in Christ. And I appreciated one person who remarked about the fact it was pointed out he had two sons there in the land of Midian, that really through being a father and what it was to raise a family and raise two sons, I'm sure played a part in really the lessons that he needed to learn. As a father myself of three children and one with the Lord, I think about how children sometimes remind us of our own failures. We recognize our own needed dependence upon the Lord. And I'm sure that this was a deeply humbling time in Moses' life as he considered what was left behind from being near accession to the throne to being a simple shepherd out in the desert where he was. These were times where he learned the ways of God and he learned it alone. It says, with respect to Gershom, his son, he said, I'd been a stranger in a strange land. The Lord didn't leave him in that place. The Lord had his eye on Moses. He knew what Israel was going through at this time. We know at the end of this next 40 years of his life that the Lord appeared to him in the burning bush. The account of that is referenced here in Acts chapter 7 and also in Exodus as well. But I think what we see here in type with respect to the burning bush is really signified Israel, who was going through, you might say, the furnace of affliction. In type, perhaps it brought a sense to Moses that they would not be consumed, that they would not be extinguished as a nation. And the Lord had his eye on that nation. And Moses was going to be the vessel through whom he would bring about this deliverance. And so this commission of Moses happened here. I'll turn briefly to it over in Exodus chapter 3. One of the first things the Lord pointed out when Moses saw that sight was the need for him to take off his shoes, for he was standing on holy ground. And Moses needed to be reminded of God's holiness. The Lord pointed out to him that he had taken notice of Israel. And I think it's precious to me in Exodus 3, verse 7, where the Lord says, I have surely seen the affliction of my people which are in Egypt, and I have heard their cry by reason of their taskmasters, for that I know their sorrows. It struck me one night I was reading this to the children after dinner, that little expression, I know their sorrows. It doesn't say explicitly here that they had cried out to the Lord. It does say they cried by reason of their affliction and their taskmasters. They were in a desperate situation. How they treated Moses 40 years earlier showed they were really looking for the deliverance promised to Abraham so many years earlier, when Abraham had been told they would be in bondage for 400 years in this country. Things were dark with Israel, and they didn't recognize the vessel through whom the Lord would use, ultimately Moses. But it's touching how the Lord reveals himself to Moses when he says that I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. A deeply personal reference to himself. And we know a little bit later that Moses really owned his nothingness in that he says, "Who am I?" A very far cry from the person that we saw in Egypt, but there was still aspects that Moses needed to learn. As we, see in this passage, he was overly focused on self and in many ways was resistant to the call of God and his commission and what he wanted him to do. Even though the Lord was gracious to him and said that I will be with thee, and he gave him that promise, Moses asked what his name was if people were to ask him when he went back to Egypt, and the Lord said, I am that I am. There was a reference to the eternal one, the self existent one, the one who always was and is and will be. We know that the Lord worked through him signs as affirmation that he would be with him. But I think that really these were meant to strengthen Moses in the weakness that he felt. But Moses still continued to hold back. He claimed that he couldn't speak well, and in effect, he basically said, send anybody else but me. 5 times, I believe it was, he raised objections to the Lord, presuming that the Lord would forbear with him. And it unfortunately ends in the Lord's anger being kindled against Moses because Moses just continued to resist and resist. This is a problem that I've had in my own life where sometimes I sense the Lord wanting me to do something, and it's very easy to be stubborn or to resist and bring self into focus where it ought not to be. And Moses had a lot to learn, as I have a lot to learn in this regard. Even though the Lord was tremendously long suffering towards him and showed forbearance towards him when these multiple times where Moses gave excuse after excuse, it's true that Moses was a very different person now. The one who had been learned in the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and deeds in those first 40 years. This was a very different person, but I think in part he tended perhaps towards self-pity over everything that happened. And one thing I think is good to point out is that the Lord's purposes will not be frustrated despite our disobedience. But we know it came at a cost because the Lord did basically say that Aaron would come and be his mouthpiece. Later, Aaron was instrumental with the golden calf and initiating what happened there. And so there was a price to pay, we might say. One, it was not really the Lord's original desire that it be with respect to Aaron. Another thing I found instructive with respect to Moses' life is at the end of chapter 4, something that needed to be dealt with respect to his own family. And we know there in chapter 4, verse 24, the Lord met him by the way and sought to kill him because he had not yet circumcised his son. And his wife was extremely angry. and called him a bloody husband. I think about that with respect to the commission he was given, that there was something that needed to be dealt with his own family before he could be fully used of the Lord. Those of us on the call who are fathers, we understand in part that there are things we know need to be dealt with at times within our own family. And we need to be obedient to what the Lord's asking us to do in that regard. We know that with respect to my own father, sometimes when there were things not right within the family household, he perhaps didn't feel free to share or speak if he knew there was trouble. It goes back to what I was saying earlier that there were lessons Moses needed to learn in that wilderness path with respect to raising children. But there was one thing he needed to take care of that the Lord had clearly instructed them to do, and that was as it related to circumcision. And so Moses carried it out. I think it also is a good reminder of the fact that perhaps he didn't do that because of influence of his wife. We don't know. She was a Gentile. I'm sure she was not used to such practices. But the influence of her spouses can be tremendous, either for good or for bad, and is really just a word of caution to those who may be listening who are not yet married and considering marriage as to the impact that one has on one's life, either for good or for bad. We should strive to find a helpmeet. The next period of his life really are the last 40 years where he really learns that God is everything, that he is nothing. And perhaps this is what most of his life is written about. I can't but scratch the surface of just a few things during this period of his life.